Welcome back to Neon Galactic, a podcast produced by Northern California PBS affiliate Keat TV. I'm James Falk. Thanks for joining us. Remember to like and follow this podcast so that we can keep asking these sorts of important questions and exploring the wickedly strange universe we all share. The man I'm interviewing today is one of those most responsible for my ongoing submersion in all things mystifying and mysterious. His various books, including now the one we'll be talking about today, have opened my eyes to a vast and intricate weave of strange facts, coincidences, occult influences, and otherwise sinister forces that largely goes unnoticed by the public at large. Coupled with the now acknowledged reality of UFOs as proclaimed by the US government, this information has transformed my worldview and sent me on a several years-long exploration to better understand the nature of our universe, the others, and ourselves. Peter Levenda, who together with Blink 182 co-founder and UFO-juggernaut Tom DeLonge, both of To the Stars, has written a nonfiction trilogy of books called Sekret Machines, Gods, Man, and War, about the UFO NHI phenomenon, its source, and the myriad implications and complexities that surround it all. The heavily anticipated final volume in this series, War, was just released. And once again, Levenda and DeLonge provide their readers with a meticulously researched and stunningly thorough examination of how this phenomenon has manifested itself through the lenses of war, conflict, invasion, colonialism, power, and a signature kind of unsettling strangeness. The book is itself a tapestry of intersecting threads, from the technologies developed by the most brilliant minds of Nazi Germany and where they ended up after World War II, to an astonishing roster of folks in and around the military-industrial complex who were themselves experiencers dabbling in dark arts and at times making contact with unknown intelligences that seemed intent on impacting human civilization. It reveals a presence in our midst, a wizard behind the curtain of history who can enchant us with glittering objects in the sky, with technologies torn from myth and fiction, and with mysteries that make us doubt our ability to understand our own experience. How much of this is just us, tinkering with tech and pursuing fantasies of conquest and dominion? How much of it is the presence or influence of some entirely different order of being? How can we tell? War ends up examining whether the lens of war is the most coherent manner of engaging this phenomenon. Citing evidence and history from many decades ago and up through this present moment, they point out that while the phenomenon has rarely, if ever, taken direct action against our species, they've also never stepped in to stop calamities from happening. Their purpose and priorities are entirely their own. Love and light hardly seem to enter this version of the story, and given our own blindness as to their motivations, simply trusting the goodwill of we know not what may actually be a recipe for surrender, capitulation. Levenda and DeLonge describe how at some of the most pivotal moments in recent history, such as the Kennedy assassination in 1963, the phenomenon was there and somehow pulling strings to unknown effect for an unknown agenda. What do we do with all this? Is information power in this case, or does our knowledge of the phenomenon merely result in more mystifying noise and a bleary, surrealist sketch of things that draws us around and around in ever-tightening circles? And if what Levenda and DeLonge point out in these books is all true, how do we find a path to preserve our species while having to simultaneously spot malignant influences and protect our own frail grasp on reality? Have we ever truly been on our own? Has this world ever really been of our making? How much of what we think we know is actually manipulation? At root, what the actual fuck is going on? Peter Levenda, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much. Glad to be here.
So I love your books. I've loved every book of yours I've read. I haven't read them all, but I was particularly fond of Sinister Forces and, of course, this one, Sekret Machines. And this one seems particularly important because we're at this moment in history where we're confronting this, potentially confronting this other and trying to figure out what our, next step should be in order to protect ourselves and embrace kind of a new reality. But for this series of books, what do you think is the most important theme or element that people generally need to take away from, war and then from the whole series generally?
Well, that's a big question.
It is.
The first thing that occurs to me is that I hope that the books have encouraged people to ask different questions. We have to reframe this subject in ways that may be uncomfortable for us to do, unfamiliar, certainly. We have to look at this without projecting our preconceived ideas onto the phenomenon. The phenomenon is there. People have said in the past that actually all the documentation that we need is already there. We just are not looking at it right. We're not asking the right questions. We're not picking apart what we already do know. We're making a lot of assumptions, and we're treating the phenomenon as though it's just another country, that's whose intentions we don't understand. There's more to it than that. It's actually a threat, but only a threat in the sense of our idea of reality. It's threatening our last few thousand years of rationality of technology, coupled with religious fanaticism as well. And it's there as a kind of a critique. It's just floating in the air. It's saying, here we are. How does all of your history fit in? Or how do we fit into your history? What is it about us that you think you know? I've read so much in the last 20, 30 years or so on this subject. A lot of it's been conspiracy theory type talk, right? And one of the things that always occurs to me, and it's occurred to me on and off through this whole project with Tom, if the phenomenon is a threat, what weapon is it using? Has it ever fired a shot in anger at anybody? Does it have weapons the way we understand it? Are there guns? Are there bullets? Are there projectiles? Are there death rays? Are there, what's going on? Because we see them. They're there constantly. Actually, they're there much more frequently than we really give them credit for. They're in the skies with impunity. All of that appears to us to be threatening. And yet they're not shooting at us, for sure. Are they holding their fire until some later date? What would prompt them to not hold their fire? What would prompt them to actually take aggressive action towards us? We have to ask a lot of questions. We think we know a lot of stuff, but we're judging the phenomenon the way we would judge another country, the way we would judge the former Soviet Union, perhaps, right? And I'm old enough to remember waking up, going to school and going through air raid drills, right? In the 1950s, where we thought it imminently the Soviets would attack us. There would be bombers over the sky. There would be missiles coming in. We've gone through this, in my lifetime so many times. And yet the phenomenon has been there all through this period. They were there during the Cold War. They were there during World War II. They were there during every part of human history. And yet they haven't dropped any bombs. They haven't shot anybody. They haven't done anything like that. There have been the abductions, right? And the contactees report abductions. And I think we have to take these people seriously, as John Mack did. Something was going on that caused trauma, right? Something happened. But what is it, right? We're not asking the right questions. And I'm hoping that the 3 volumes of Sekret Machines at least makes people stop and think and say to themselves, I never thought about it like that. I never thought that we should do it this way. I never thought we should judge them according to these ideas, right? It's always been us versus them. It's always been this alien force that's threatening us with invasion. It's Independence Day, right? Or War of the Worlds. This is how we're thinking of it. We're terrified. And our defense establishment seems to be terrified of the prospects that this presents. I've talked to people in the defense establishment who say their biggest fear is that what's going on is a test of our defenses as a preliminary to actually a strike of some kind or an invasion of some kind. So they keep thinking about this, but they've been thinking about this since 1947 at least, right? And that's longer than I've been around. And I've been around a while. There has been no attack by an alien force. So whoever was, there in 1947, are they still there? Are they still calling the shots? Is it an alien organic being that's behind this? Haven't they aged at all in the last 75 years or so? Is it a cyborg? Is it some kind of construction? Is it robotic, right? That has pre-planned instructions. They're just obeying pre-planned instructions. We have no way of knowing it. But my feeling is we have enough data at our disposal that if we just looked at it without preconceived ideas, we could figure some of this out.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, one of the debates that's gone on is whether we should be looking at this through the rubric of war. And I think your book does a great job of sort of backing up and saying, well, is it? But then it's also answering the question of, or sort of positing that we have to look at it in some sense in that way because we don't know what we're facing. I have a quote here of yours from the book I want to read. This is about war and about conflict and aggression and survival, but it is also a critique of war and a plea for understanding how war develops, its inner nature and structure, so that we may be prepared for a future in which a race of beings will have better weapons than we do, weapons that are not restricted to bullets and bombs, but weapons of consciousness, of perception, communication, and perspective, weapons with an ability to manipulate our reality like the proverbial hypnotist makes a man think he's a chicken. Um, I mean, it's like we can't afford not to think in terms of war, but then every way that we've considered war or waged war seems like, at least from this moment, to be absolutely impossibly ineffective against an enemy like this. So, I mean, do you believe in your own heart that we're either at war now or will be at war with this thing? And what does the government believe about that?
Yeah. Okay. The government believes, I mean, there are individuals and there are groups
Of
within them.
course,
Let me
yeah,
clarify.
it's complex, but
Yeah, it's complicated. There's a lot of people who don't want to pay attention to this at all. There are other people in government who thinks this is a spiritual war that's taking place, that the UFO phenomenon, the UAP phenomenon is angels and demons, right? So there's that whole segment of our
yeah,
government that scares me more probably than the
yeah,
aliens.
absolutely.
And then there's the people who think that this may be a preliminary to an invasion. Um, from my perspective, we have to redefine war, as I try to do in these books. Let's stop thinking of it in terms of physical invasion of weapons of mass destruction and that sort of thing. The Nazis came up with this term. It's a great term, and they call it worldview warfare, right? And we call it psychological warfare, but they went an extra step and they say it's a conflict between two worldviews. Let's take that and take it just a little bit further and think to ourselves, if the phenomenon represents a threat to us, the threat is that it's going to change our consciousness. And we're not ready for that. We're uncomfortable with that. We've got guys out in the desert taking ayahuasca, and stuff like that. And it's a voluntary kind of thing, right? And they have a shaman and they have a guide and all the rest of it. But what if this change of consciousness takes place on a massive scale, right? What if they, and with quotes, are using our own internet against us, in a sense? We would feel that it's against us, but maybe it's opening our minds, right? Maybe it's causing us to question reality completely. Maybe that's the point. Maybe that's not a bug, it's a feature. We're going to make you question reality. You're going to see videos that are impossible about people that were not really there when that video was taken. There's going to be deep fakes. There's going to be AI manipulated everything. And you're going to get to the point where you question all of reality. Does that open a hole, a kind of a hole, an entranceway into our consciousness for this phenomenon to enter when we start questioning everything, right? So war can be different kinds of things. And it was regarded very early on in the 20th century that if you manipulate the consciousness of your target country or your target population, you can win a war without firing a shot. Well, what's happened with the UFO phenomenon so far? They haven't fired a shot. So if we are thinking in a warlike footing, we have to say to ourselves, they're using some other kind of weapon, right? Their territorial objectives are not the physical planet. It's maybe the people living on the planet. Maybe it's the consciousness of the people who are here, right? And they're going to affect different countries in different ways. Maybe they're astute enough to realize there's certain cultural differences, and they're sort of wending their way through all of that. All of these things have to be considered. If you're trying to defend the country, if you're trying to defend the United States, you've got to sit there and say, how do we define the United States? Is it just the physical territory? Do we have to defend our culture? Do we have to defend our perception of others, of other countries? What has to be defended now if it's not just the territory? What else is in danger of being occupied? And I think those are the questions we have to ask, not because we're paranoid about it, which we may be, but we have to ask them because it will force us to think differently about this entire phenomenon. It'll force us to get into the right headspace, to begin asking the right questions.
This leads perfectly into my next question. I've noticed in following the threads of your work and then also Tom's with Monsters of California and whatnot, there's a thread that runs through there that our consciousness has been manipulated and will continue to be manipulated possibly by this other. And that it's something that has been attested to by people who have had all kinds of contact and all kinds of scenarios. And it makes me wonder, Pasulka has written about it. And I mean, there's just visionaries throughout history who have had contact with some other intelligence that at times has given them good information, at times has tormented people, but it's an encounter that's ongoing. If that is the true face of what contact and potentially, this presence is going to be, how can individual people protect themselves? Is there a hygiene method, or is there a way that people can begin to understand that their consciousness may be a front in a new kind of conflict, and therefore they can, take steps to not be a victim?
Well, the short answer is yes. The long answer, though, is probably nobody wants to hear. The short answer is yes. Of course, you can defend yourself to an extent against this type of intrusion. But that's been the province of, spiritual leaders throughout the centuries, because when we talk about manipulating our consciousness, it's entirely possible, as the case we try to make in the very first volume of Sekret Machines, the cargo cult idea, that our religions, as well as our science, were jump-started by contact.
Exactly. So, I mean, it's all a manipulation in a way,
Exactly. It's all a manipulation. So, our religions that we're clinging to defend us against this force, it's ironic that those religions may have been instigated by contact. So, they're going to use our institutions against us in that sense. I'm not saying that they're malevolent. I don't know. We don't know. We're projecting ideas of benevolent and malevolent onto something which may be immaterial. But from our perspective, what is it that we want to protect? We have to start there, right? Do we want to protect our way of thinking, which has led to so much strife and so much aggression and everything else? If we don't want to defend that, then how much of it are we willing to give up? So if we want to defend ourselves, there have been secret societies, let's say. There have been religious groups. There have been groups that have taught this type of spiritual strengthening. And it involves not just praying a lot and saying, go away, please, la, la, la. Not that kind, but the kind that actually goes into that subject, the kind that says, let me know more about it. Let me see, how do we make contact with them? Is it always just a one-way street, or is it a two-way street? How do we start understanding how our brains work, how our consciousness really works? Can we trick these things into answering us, into talking to us, communicating in some way? So there's been a tradition of occultism that's bad word these days. It's been a bad word for a long time. But occultism is the framework, the general framework for a set of practices and ideas of making that kind of spiritual contact, of strengthening oneself. In the 20th century, they would have said body of light, trying to strengthen your body of light and make it more impervious to attack. And then using that body of light to go into their area, of consciousness, and trying to understand what's really happening, what's really going on. Is there a program? Is there a plan? Is there a structure that we can understand, that we can learn about this without endangering ourselves? CIA at one point, I don't want to keep on hitting on the CIA as I normally do, but CIA back in the 1950s and 60s were aggressively pursuing this program, this very program of Bluebird, Artichoke, and eventually MK Ultra. Let's understand how the brain works. How does consciousness actually work? Can we use hypnosis? Can we use drugs? Can we use ritual? I mean, what do all these things do to consciousness? Is it possible to manipulate consciousness? Of course, they were doing it from a very different set of reasons, but we can use the same, not the same methods, which are dangerous, but we can investigate those techniques and withdraw from it what might be workable, which is a weird thing, for us to say. But I think for a lot of people, they may find CIA a bit more accessible than saying, for instance, some weird grimoire of, spiritual contact and conjurations and stuff. By taking baby steps and by trying to figure out, what does hypnosis do? What does that really mean? Some psychiatrists say hypnosis doesn't even exist. And there's other groups that say, oh, it's very powerful. One group said, there's no way you can manipulate memory. That's bogus science. Another group says, no, you can definitely manipulate memory. And the funny thing is, both of those groups have roots to CIA, right? So there's been no general consensus of agreement here.
Yeah.
And that very level of confusion is very revealing, right? Even with the best minds at their disposal, with doctors, psychiatrists, with physicists, with all sorts of people, and witches and warlocks, they still can't come up with a method. They know it's there. It's lurking there. They come up against it, as John Mack's patients had, right? People who claimed they had been abducted by aliens, and they're all suffering from PTSD. There's something very real happened.
Yeah.
So what we have to do is fall back a little bit, look at those accounts of what they experienced, and try to put together a kind of plan of action. How do we prepare people for that experience? Will abductions go on the rise? They seem to have tapered off. Will they come back again? If so, what is the best thing you can tell people to do? I'm in Florida right now. We just had a hurricane pass through, right?
Yeah.
So they're always telling you all these things you have to do in the event of a hurricane, how to prepare for a hurricane. It's the same thing. We should tell people how to prepare for this experience without beating them over the head over it, without creating, how shall I put it, a panic or hysteria that this is imminent. Just saying, if you have this kind of an experience, this is what you should do. And just gently start from there. I think that would be useful. You don't have to go and join some weird, occult order or secret society to do this. But you can become aware that throughout history, there have been very definite programs of how you go about doing this. In ancient Middle East, you had the Hechelot and Merkaba mystics, right? Who ascended, to the seven heavens, as they called it, stage by stage by stage. And this is very old, a very ancient technique going back almost to prehistoric times. If you can learn from this, you can learn from these practices, because they're kind of universal. You can go to different countries and read very similar accounts of individual people trying to make that kind of contact.
And they all seem to describe the same kinds of experiences and the same kinds of journey through different layers of it. And so it seems like to me that there's something real happening there. Anyway.
Oh, it's real for sure.
Yeah.
It's and these methods are there. They're in print. I mean, I've written about them. I wrote a book called Stairway to Heaven, which really goes through and describes how different cultures have approached it. I'm having this thing in February, as you probably have heard, at Joshua Tree. We're going to try to talk it through, as well as try, basic things, basic exercises, let's say, for this type of technology. And it is a kind of technology, and it's meeting the other on its own terms, rather than waiting for something to happen, waiting to see lights in the sky. I mean, I've been involved in studying this for decades and decades. And I only had a UFO experience a few years ago, right? It's really not necessary to have that first and then to go on from there. It just happened, out of the clear blue sky, no pun intended. And it just happened, and it was there. And I was totally, unprepared for it from the point of view as I didn't realize that's what it was when it was happening. My mind deliberately made up all kinds of excuses for what I was seeing until I finally, after one after the other, the cards fell, and I said, okay, it's a UFO. So it's not like you automatically will know what's going on. You may not, but you'll be prepared. And that's the important thing.
Yeah. All that was absolutely fascinating. The one question I've had repeatedly myself is that I've been introduced to a lot of mysticism through your work and others. And part of me wonders, as I'm, going through these exercises or doing this kind of practice, is that itself a manipulation? And how do we know whether it is or not? I mean, if religions were inspired by this other, and mysticism is an extension or a clarification maybe of certain religious practices, or maybe the original inspiration for it, how do we know that that's not itself a way of making ourselves more susceptible? Can we ever know?
Well, from my perspective, and it's just one perspective, our religions and all of the things that you just mentioned were a reaction to contact. I don't think the contactors implanted religion. I
Okay,
think
okay.
appearance was our reaction to it was religion, was mysticism, was all the rest of it. In fact, in ancient times, there was no division of something called religion. There was no such word. Religion is a relatively recent discovery or a recent invention, let's say. In ancient Egypt, there was no division between your culture, being an Egyptian, and religion. The gods were part of the culture. Everything was geared towards that mentality. And I think because of some kind of contact that I posit happened maybe 25,000 years ago or longer, where people suddenly organized themselves around us. It was an organizing principle that there was contact. There was something up there, something in the stars. And it was powerful. And it seemed to be all-knowing. It seemed to have abilities that we as humans didn't have. And that created this desire, this thirst to make that contact, to bring it back. As the ancient Sumerians would say on top of their ziggurats, spirit of the earth remembers, spirit of the skies remember. Don't forget us here. There was this idea that we had been contacted. And now we're building all these temples and all this other stuff and creating religions, which were really just state-sponsored initially, methods of trying to bring contact back, trying to encourage them to return, right? So I think that our religions were a reaction to it as opposed to, a direct manipulation of us. The appearance was the manipulation, right? They just showed up in the sky right away. You're being manipulated. I mean, there's no way around it. I mean, it's there. And so you have to react somehow. And I think that's what happened. And we started developing technologies and techniques for reinforcing that contact safely, right? Because we recognized also there was a danger in it. And so we came up with this idea that there's good spirits and bad spirits. It's probably just all the same spirit. The question is, are we defending ourselves against it? Are we accommodating it? Are we, including it in our consciousness, or are we frightened of it as it's scaring the hell out of us? One of the earliest concepts of God in the Bible, for instance, is God as being something terrifying. You cannot look upon the face of God, right?
Yeah.
And God was just this terror. I mean, you were in terror of it. So here was something that was supposedly beneficent, supposedly your creator, and yet it scared the hell out of you, right? So we don't know. Does that mean God was evil then? If we're frightened of it, is it evil? Or is that something that's a weakness in us? So these are all things that we have to confront if we're dealing with the phenomenon in a proactive way. Otherwise, we're just back to the old, paradigm. It's an evil thing. It might be invading us. It might kill us. We have to defend ourselves. And it's like, okay, good luck. How do you defend yourself against those tic tacs?
Yeah, it's
fighting. Yeah, how do you do that? Tell me.
Yeah.
How's that working out for you? This idea of defending yourself against something that appears and disappears at will, that screws with your cameras, that screws with your radar and sonar, that makes fun of you, basically, turns off your weapon silos, right? Turns on and off nuclear facilities and just says hi and then goes away. How do you defend yourself? So you're being forced to find a different way. And I think that's what we need to do. And that's why I always say we need everybody on board with this, not just the scientists, the military engineers, the technicians. We need everybody on our side in this, including the artists and the musicians and the writers, the soft sciences, the philosophers, the psychiatrists, the psychologists, all of the anthropologists for sure. All of these disciplines have to get to work on this problem because it's going to require a complete paradigm shift where consciousness is concerned to accommodate this. And it's for our defense, if you look at it from that point of view. This is a national defense or an international defense issue because every country is being affected by this. And if one
self-defense, right? I mean, and individual, it's like it goes the whole scale up and down both.
Yeah.
It's like we're each kind of responsible for our own protection, it sounds like, on some level. And then society has to generate the mechanisms or the tools by which we can begin to defend ourselves. That's a problem. That's a huge, massive conundrum. And it's going to be amazing to see if we can, coalesce enough to begin to have that kind of cooperation, because we haven't demonstrated that ability yet.
No, for sure. We haven't. And, people have said over the past, I mean, we had Reagan in front of the United Nations saying, there could be this alien presence coming down to the planet. We have to get together to defend ourselves against it. Would that be possible? He asked that question, can we do this? And every country that we know of, including our biggest potential foes, Russia and China, have gotten enormous UFO contact, right, over the years. I mean, to the extent where they knew as little about it as we do. I mean, and we're all protecting our ignorance. Don't tell them what we don't know, right? And everybody's doing the same thing, and it's kind of pointless because these things are not making agreements with one country over another. I mean, they're just not. Okay, I know people like to think that. They think there was some contract that was signed between, Truman or Eisenhower and the other. And does that make any sense at all if you stop and think about it? How does that work? And who enforces that contract, right? What if somebody reneges? What do you do? What do you do to the alien?
What court do you go to enforce your contract?
You go to court? I mean, what? So that obviously has not happened, and it can't happen, right? So the other countries are in the same boat that we are. And we're all sitting there, the blind leading the blind, right? Or the blind men and the elephant, right? So you have the Russian idea, the Chinese idea, our idea. We're looking at the same elephant, trying to describe what it is, but we're blind. So it's the famous parable of the blind men and the elephant. Except in our case, the elephant keeps changing shape. And that causes even more complete disharmony and lack of communication between the countries. So Kennedy, at one point, President Kennedy had said, maybe we should work with the Soviets on space exploration, and a month later he was dead. I'm not saying those two things were connected, but there was an opportunity lost there for sure. So we don't trust other countries. They don't trust us. And yet this is the most important secret, the most important check on reality that we have as a planet. And we're not talking to each other on it. There may be sub rosa contacts between some scientists here and some scientists there, or military types or engineers, philosophers maybe, who knows. There may be these kinds of discussions taking place, but they're not moving the ball forward very far. And so we have to pay attention to the sightings when they occur, not just in our country, but in other countries. We have that data, let's face it. We have satellites, we have the Earth covered. We should be able to know when these things are happening, when sightings are taking place in different countries, just as they have satellites watching us. So at some point, we should be able to collate this data and draw some important conclusions from it.
Yeah. You mentioned that there's no agreements between countries, and I get that, and I understand it and agree with it. But then, there's a lot of discussion in your book and then through your history as a researcher and historian, talk about Nazi Germany, and you make a very strong case that parts of the Nazi Empire survived as various enterprises around the world. And my question to you is, do parts of the current military industrial complex, or sometimes you're sourcing for the books, do they currently believe that there is some kind of branch of what was the Nazi Party still operative in the world? And is there a theory that they are aligned with the phenomenon in some sense?
They wouldn't frame it that way. As bluntly as you just did, they wouldn't say that necessarily. Mm-hmm. The facts, however, are inescapable, that there was a massive expatriation of assets, personnel, money, technology that was taking place out of Nazi Germany in 1944 when D-Day happened, and everybody knew the handwriting was on the wall. So the SS moved enormous amounts overseas. Some of it was already there, obviously, but then they started moving everything overseas. Just so that when the Allies took Germany, they wouldn't take everything. So we know that happened. We know that we took a bunch of scientists famously under Operation Paperclip. What we didn't realize, or people don't talk about it very much, is the Soviet Union took maybe double or triple the number of scientists, Nazi scientists, into Russia, including their families and everything else, and created entire bases where nothing but Nazi scientists were working on weapons and aviation technology and all the aeronautics, everything, missile technology. They had already been working on it at Peenemünde and then at Nordhausen. So they already had the documents. They had a lot of background. They were developing a flying saucer, for crying out loud, right? The Horton brothers were doing this. So we know that existed. And we know that the infrastructure existed overseas for the longest time. Personnel that were wanted war criminals were operating with impunity overseas. Now, all those guys are for the most part dead, right? So how does that maintain itself once, Germany became united eventually in the 1990s, and then everything started coming back together again? Did everybody go back home? Why? Right? If they were already entrenched in countries around the world, and we have reason to believe they were very much involved, for instance, in the overthrow of Sukarno in Indonesia, right? I've been writing about that and talking about it to other groups, that we know there was a very large Nazi presence at the German embassy in Jakarta. And I wrote about a guy who had fled to Indonesia, had something to do with a lot of money that was transferred to Jakarta after the war. So there was a lot of investment and infrastructure by the Nazi Party and by people sympathetic to the Nazis, like Hjalmar Schacht, who was the former Nazi finance minister. He was meeting with Sukarno and later advising people how to develop a kind of an Islamic crescent buffer against China, for instance.
Yeah, and that's another question that ties into it, is whether the Arab states have ever or were ever sort of manipulated or in league with that, element.
Well, I mean, there were. I mean,
Yeah.
Skorzeny famously operated out of Egypt for a while. There were Nazi scientists in Egypt that were building rockets to attack Israel.
Yeah.
Frederick Forsyth's book, the Odessa File, was based on initially that very true, very real episode in history. So you had this everywhere. You had some of the Palestinian PLO types that were being financed by Nazi scientists, Nazi bankers out of Switzerland.
And you mentioned Yasser Arafat in the book, right?
Yep. Yeah.
Some
Yes,
connection there. Yeah.
sure. There was. I mean, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? So you had
Yeah.
all of this going on. It was, and Skorzeny was very famous for this. Skorzeny was involved in American politics, right? He was involved in European politics. His fingerprints were everywhere. And I talked to somebody who worked in the Lyndon Johnson administration in the Defense Department, and they were working, openly, or at least openly to them. They were operating with Hans Ulrich Rudel, which was the famous Nazi pilot that Hitler loved so much. And Rudel was running a kind of an Odessa of his own throughout the world. And here he was as an advisor to the American administration on developing new aircraft, what they should do to develop better aircraft. So when you ask a question like that, we think in terms of, a bunch of Nazis in a room and, a factory, and they're churning out, weapons. It was actually much more insidious than that. They just managed to infiltrate themselves in various levels of society. Our space program, was jump-started by Nazis, people who had horrible records as war criminals that we just didn't care. And yet we wound up putting people like Oppenheimer, not in jail necessarily, but getting rid of their security clearances and firing them. People like Oppenheimer, who defended the country, right, who developed the atomic bomb, were then considered a security risk, but Werner von Braun wasn't. I mean, Walter Dornberger wasn't. Strudel wasn't. All these guys were not security risks, but Oppenheimer was. So you could see there was this tremendous shift that took place in the United States. You didn't have to have a Nazi swastika flag waving presence in the U.S. You just had to have a bunch of people who were sympathetic, to the Nazis and protecting war criminals, and paying them off and hiding them in South America. That's all you needed to have, right? Or Nazi scientists working for you openly in American cities and towns. I mean, we're looking in the wrong place, like an Indiana Jones movie. They're digging in the wrong place. That's what we're doing. We're worrying about the Nazi presence here. We're digging in the wrong place. We're looking for an actual war criminal in a basement somewhere developing a bomb. They were openly working for us. There was no concealment of this. We just got used to it, and we made excuses for it.
It's interesting, you mentioned worldview warfare and the way that we absorbed the Nazi scientists and then also kind of modeled our intelligence apparatus on what they had done. And then Galen, I guess we kind of annexed the system that they were using, and he became the head of intelligence for West Germany. It's like, in the end, their worldview wheedled its way into ours and became sort of this intelligence edifice. I'm not saying all people in intelligence are Nazis, but there is a level of secrecy and privilege there that they assume that is, vaguely fascist. And, we've been tainted by a lot of those ideals. And how do you begin to pull that apart? Or can you ever? I don't know.
No, we're struggling with that still.
Yeah.
We're still dealing with people who are demonizing the other and calling them communists, right?
Mm-hmm.
And really, I mean, I worked with China from the 80s for 20 years. I was constantly in China negotiating contracts and everything else. That's a communist country. And even though it's gotten very, very capitalist looking, it's run by the Communist Party. And in the 1980s, when I started, it was very communist. Right? Everybody wore Mao jackets. They had the little red book. That was my environment for years, right? I was
Yeah.
dealing with in that structure with Communist Party members at every meeting to make sure I wasn't, spiritually polluting people with, with my
Wow.
capitalist ideas. So this kind of stuff, went on and on. That's communism, right? But in this country, at the end of World War II, the big enemy was not the Nazis, it was communism. It was the Soviet Union and to an extent China, and then eventually Korea, et cetera, et cetera. So communism was the big enemy. And because communism was the enemy, the Nazis started looking good, right? Because the Nazis were standing up against the communists. And on top of that, you had the other problem, which was the Catholic Church also feared communism much more than they ever feared Nazism or fascism. So you had the Catholic Church providing cover for war criminals, right? Giving them fake papers and everything else because they were being enlisted in the fight against communism. Once you draw that binary line, you're kind of screwed. You're either on this side or the other side, right? If you're not on my side, you're against me. If you're not with me, you're against me. So that's our problem. We still have that problem today. We're still talking about communists, how evil communism is. And yeah, let's face it, it didn't work. Except, in China, which is one of the most powerful countries on the planet right now. But nobody wants to talk about communism in China, right? They will
Yeah.
talk about China as being the enemy, but they won't go to the obvious conclusion. Well, you keep attacking communism. Isn't China communist? Isn't it run by the Communist Party? Right? Or don't they call all the shots? So they want to look at Venezuela, yeah, okay, or Cuba. But yeah, look at China too, right? So it's not a question of ideologies or anything else, it's power. Who has the power? What are they willing to do to hold on to the power? And we idolized Nazis in this country, in our political systems. We did, We had, I wrote about this in the Hitler Legacy at length. We had a really big problem in this country in the 1940s and 1950s where we could have gone after Nazi war criminals in Latin America. We knew where they were. We had dossiers. We knew exactly what was going on. But there was such a push in Congress against that because to go after the Nazis meant that you were soft on communism, right? And since communism was the enemy, leave the Nazis alone and go after the communists. Like we couldn't chew gum and walk at the same time. We
Yeah.
couldn't go after both. And that was part of the reason of our downfall. So we brought in Nazi scientists for paperclip and in all other parts of our society. We supported Nazi presences in Latin America. We had Klaus Barbie, who was running a Secret Service operation in Bolivia, who had been protected by American intelligence. You had, as you mentioned, Galen, who ran not only West German intelligence, but he was really the CIA's man in Western Europe, right? Running operations against the Soviets. I mean, just, So once you make that willingness to deal with the enemy this way, to deal with people who are responsible for some hideous war crimes, and you're saying you shrug it off and say, well, the communists are worse. You've sold your soul to the devil, as I've said many times in different books. This was the beginning of our problem that we have today, this demonizing of the other that takes
Yeah.
place, which, it replaces logical thought. It replaces thinking through a problem to the end. So we just have buzzwords. We have fascist and communist and Nazi and socialist, and that's it, right? In a country that doesn't really have, much of either, but we like to think that it does. We like to think that our enemies are, devil worshippers and stuff. So this
Yeah.
is where this is the tunnel we've gone down. It's a rabbit hole, and it's really hard to climb out of it because it's easier to think in those terms than it is to think rationally.
Which is interesting to me because if the Nazis were manipulated by the other, by the phenomenon, or I mean they had all these occult trappings and some at root philosophical connections to the occult. I mean, was that the mechanism through which maybe they got sort of philosophically polluted? And I mean, do you think that they were in league with some kind of phenomenon or being led by the phenomenon?
I mean, philosophically, you might
Okay.
say, sure.
Yeah.
look at it this way: the motivating factor of the Third Reich was the idea of a superior race.
Yeah.
Once you set that up, then you open the door to all the rest of it, right? If there's a superior race, where did it come from? That was the next question. And the Nazis answered it. Well, it came from this mysterious place called Tula, right? And they had the Tula Gesellschaft, which was really where the Nazi party started, was in the same hotel in the same room as the Tula Gesellschaft, which was this mystical proto-Nazi organization, which the swastika was their symbol. And they were pagans. They were Teutonic. They were trying to bring back German paganism. And so there was this idea that there was a superior race that existed, thousands of years earlier or millions of years earlier. And they had a guy called Willigut Weistor, who was like the number two man, for Heinrich Himmler and the SS. He depended so much on this guy's, visions of what the Nazi past was, what the Aryan race used to be, and all of this. And there's this, this alien connection there. This was a race descended from the stars, and that, the true-blooded Aryans contain within themselves this pure genetic quality that nobody else had, that all the other races were degenerate forms of it, or didn't have any participation at all in it. So you had, the idea against the Jews being an inferior race was not just that they were inferior, they were an other race of humans, or maybe not even human, according to this system. The Aryans were the real divinely engendered race, right? Everybody else was Mongol races, or they were alien races completely. And that's how they divided the world. This was the rationale they developed. And so, yeah, there's this idea. I think the Nazis themselves believed that they were in contact with superior forces. Himmler especially did. And that's why he built Wewelsburg Castle. This is why he had this whole idea of, the Knights of the Round Table. There would be 12 leaders, and their ashes would be buried in this castle. And they would have seances and channel the forces of ancient Teutonic masters and magicians and kings and leaders. And that the back of all of this was, we came from the stars, right? Hyperborea. We were going to go back to the stars. We were going to, we were divinely inspired. Everybody else is worthless, racially. They were intended to be our slaves. So this was their concept. Once you develop that, it's not much further to go, right? To go from there to this idea of a UFO, of the tall blondes, the Nordics, right? I mean, there it is, right there. The racism is built into this idea, and all these multiple races that people talk about in the UFO community. Isn't that part of the masquerade, right? Isn't that part of the game that's being played? Some people, through their consciousness, are witnessing this phenomenon, and they're seeing little gray men, right? Others, like Whitley Strieber, saw little blue fuckers. Remember that? And then,
yes.
And then there was, what's his name? One of the earliest contactees with the Venusians and everything else, talking about
I forget. Yeah, Adamski, right?
Adamski.
Yeah.
So, and he was having meetings with like world leaders and stuff, right? And he's talking about it. And his were the Venusians, and they were tall, blonde, blue-eyed types, right? So, I mean, you're playing right into all of this. So, if you're asking, did they actually make contact? Every society has made contact one way or the other. There has been contact because contact has been ongoing for centuries and centuries. Contact has been ongoing. So everybody's had contact. It's how you react to it, how you develop it, how you understand it, interpret it, and then put it into action that makes us different. And that means we don't have the whole picture. We just have a little piece of the puzzle. And we're taking this one piece and we're building an entire picture around it. And then with the passage of time, that picture will disappear because it will be shown to be false. But the Nazi thing is very powerful in people's minds because it has a symbol, it has the swastika, it has a history that you can point to, it has the Mein Kampf, and all the writings of the Nazis are there, so it casts a spell over a lot of people. They think this is really cool, right? Which they wouldn't think if they had been to where I've been, if they had gone to South America, if they had gone to Europe, if they had gone to Argentina or Chile and met these guys face to face. They're like one step above drooling idiots. They have one idea, one fixation. They don't deny the Holocaust. I've never met a Nazi from the war that denied the Holocaust. Right? That said it didn't
they're
happen.
proud of it, I'm
They're
sure, or
proud of it. They wish they had
yeah.
finished the job. That's all. That's what they always say, right? So that's like nonsense right there. So I mean, it's like, what are you dealing with? You know, you're dealing with an other for sure when you're dealing with this type of ideology. But
Hmm.
is it purely degraded human ideology and not something from the stars?
That's fascinating, and I think important for people to hear. I'm going to change directions a little bit. I interviewed Seth Peribson. That's a pen name, but he's done a lot of research and theorizing around what NHI, at least a slice of NHI, may be. And I was struck by a quote in the book. I'll read it again. Sorry for this, but an alien invasion, should it take place, if it has not already, will be unlike anything we understand by the term. It may take place under very different circumstances. We may awaken one day to find that we have been less invaded than somehow contaminated. A virus, a bacterium, either as the weapon or as the alien itself, like those unfortunate homeowners who discover that a colony of insects has been living in the walls of their home unnoticed. For years, we may already be at the mercy of the alien. Maybe it is living in the walls of our homes. Maybe it occupies a dimension perpendicular to ours. In any of these cases, there will be no question of a treaty, for a treaty assumes a degree of equivalence and similarity, and from all reports, we share none with the alien. That got me thinking, and Seth's basically positing that a small segment of what, or a relatively large segment actually, of what we're encountering as NHI may actually be fungus that has colonized the human body, and through mechanisms that he demonstrates with science and slides, and he's done a lot of really interesting research. He thinks that fungus has been able to demonstrate a level of control over the human mind. Are you hearing anything about things like that? I mean, about the possibility of it being something small and what we consider, relatively non-intrusive, but is actually having some sort of toxic effect on humanity?
Well, sure, as that quotation demonstrates, that's something that's been discussed and thought about, and come up with as a possibility. And fungus is really a very good vector for that sort of thing. Um, I mean, I've been fascinated myself reading about fungi. And there have been books written about it by scientists that are just like crazy about them, saying this is the largest organisms on the planet are mushrooms. Huge fields of mushrooms that take up acres and acres of land. And they're fascinated by it because they have this invulnerability, really. You can't really get rid of them once you've got them. This is like these things where you have to really take drastic measures to get rid of a fungus of any kind, whether it's in the body or it's in a house or any place else. But to pull back a little bit, yes, if this presence can infect our consciousness with memes, let's say, with ideas, with images, because they seem to communicate in images. That's the first step, that contactees were always talking about seeing pictures in their head, and that was the communication medium. Well, now we see pictures online, right? We see millions of them every week. Sorting through them is becoming extremely difficult. So they're there. That's the beginning. That's a consciousness thing. Why wouldn't it also be a kind of bacterium that we would never notice at first, right?
Yeah.
Because our body is full of them. Any scientist, any bioengineer will tell you that our bodies are, just playgrounds for all sorts of stuff that really doesn't really come to our attention until sometimes it's too late, right?
Yeah.
And they start to multiply, and then you've got a problem. But they're there. We all carry, for instance, cancer cells within us. Every single one of us is carrying it. We're carrying cancer cells. There's no way to get rid of them. They're there. But our immune systems are dealing with it, and they go in, they go out, and as long as we don't exacerbate the situation, they're not a problem. But we're not conscious of it, right? We have these cells, cancer, we have different kinds of bacteria, different kinds of virus loads that are within us that we're not always conscious of. Sometimes we're never conscious our entire lives that these things exist. So to slip one in that midst, in that morass, that stew of viruses and bacteria, to slip one in, it's got to be really easy.
Yeah.
Now, one thing that fascinated me, and I wrote about this not in Sekret Machines, I don't think, but in the Lovecraft novels that I wrote, was the idea that it's been demonstrated that you can take a, how shall I put this? You can infect a computer with DNA, right? DNA is a code, and computers operate on codes. And there have been ways of trying to insert a virus into a computer program, but the virus is actually the DNA code itself that's been encoded and sent to the computer. And now the computer has a virus, but it's an actual virus. It's not a computer virus. There's been a lot of writing about the interface between computers and the DNA code. And the DNA code is basically at heart just zeros and ones. Well, it's four codes, but four basic, amino acids. But basically, that's all that it is. It's a code. It's these four letters. And if you manipulate the four letters in certain ways, you get certain, characteristics. Well, there was a way of taking, a DNA on a petri dish and put it on a slide, and then that RNA or DNA then infects the computer itself. The division between, what I'm trying to point out is the division between the machine and the biology now is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. It's getting very, very thin, to the point where we can't imagine infecting a robot, for instance, with a human virus, or vice versa, infecting a human with some kind of robotic or artificially created virus. So if we can do that, we have to assume that there's a they that can do that as well, which means that there's a very good possibility we're carrying this as a code within ourselves that won't be activated until a specific time or place or set of circumstances. I write about in Sekret Machines, what if we all wake up one morning all having had the same dream, right? Isn't that like the ultimate manipulation of an entire race of people on the planet? So is it possible? Can these things take place? Can they happen? To me, all the science that we have now is our ability and our desire to duplicate what we remember from the past, from what we remember of this contact. We're now doing it. We're building machines that can do things that the Nimitz Tic Tacs, can do. We're getting there. We're getting close, right? We're getting close to understanding the science behind it, which may involve a science consciousness interface, but we're getting close to it. We're getting close to duplicating a lot of the stuff that was science fiction only 50 years ago. Now we're doing it regularly. We're doing it so fast that we haven't built in the proper social awareness of the effects of this at all. And we're designing algorithms that are building in a lot of our weaknesses, a lot of our biases, a lot of our psychological imperfections are being built into the algorithms that are controlling AI, for instance. So we have these issues that we have yet to face, but we will be facing them very soon. And is this the equivalent of an interference in our systems by something from outside of our system?
That was exactly, I mean, you've sort of answered my questions sequentially before I even get to them. But the AI question, I mean, like a lot of people have been looking toward AI as potentially like the moment where we can potentially even the battlefield, right? Like we'll have the computational power to maybe ascertain patterns that we haven't been able to see, generate answers, maybe even potentially protect ourselves. But how do we know ultimately, like you mentioned, the internet maybe being manipulated by some sort of other to influence our consciousness? How would we ever know if AI wasn't an instrument or inspired by the phenomenon? And what do we do with that kind of information? How do we continue to develop things that are potentially manipulatable by this other who may not have our best interests at heart?
Well, again, we have to define what our best interests are, right?
Yeah.
We have an idea what our best interests are, and let's face it, we're pretty screwed up. So
exactly
when we think of our best interests, maybe it's not really our best interests, but it's what we think they are. And this other may have another idea of what our best interests are, right? And that's what is scary, because quite frankly, they're not going to be the same. If they were the same, they probably wouldn't be here, right? So they're here for some reason. It's possibly because our interests do not coincide too well. So to get back to your question, how do we know? I think about an old myth, an old story. Berosus wrote about, long story, I won't go into all of it, but there was this creature who was called Oannes in his text that came out of the sea, And this creature came out of the sea and instructed humanity in the sciences, right? And would come up in the morning, would teach humanity, and then would not eat or drink anything that was offered to him, nothing, and would go back into the ocean. And they described him as wearing a weird suit. He looked like a fish. He had a kind of fish head, but a kind of human face. And he would come out of the ocean and teach and then go back in. That's an ancient, ancient story of someone that came down from somewhere, some other environment. And they would come out and talk to humans, but would not eat or drink, quite interestingly, right? Because if you're an epidemiologist, you would understand why they wouldn't want to eat or drink with humans, right, on the planet. They would go back to their own environment and not really get contaminated too much. And they wore some kind of suit, which maybe they were not even breathing our air. So that's an ancient story. That goes back thousands of years, right? And the Sumerians had a version of that story. And this seems to be in the development of that Sumerian story. So we're talking thousands of years. This thing comes down, teaches everybody, but the details are fascinating. Will not eat, will not drink, will not breathe the air, right? Will not spend overnight on the planet, go back into the ocean. So was that a cyborg? Was that an alien being? Was that a robot of some kind? Did we already understand this possibility existed? And now we're developing AI because we've been implanted with this concept since ancient times. It's been with us in our bloodstream for a very long time. And now we're trying to do that. We're duplicating that in an effort to make that contact again. And I think that AI is going in that direction, and it's going really fast. And it's going a bit too fast for my taste, because we haven't thought of all the ramifications yet. We haven't made sure that our algorithms are not slanted one way or another towards one set of values rather than another set of values, or cultural ideas or anything like that. So we're just going to do this, and we're going to see what happens, And it's like old Jack Parsons, out in the desert with his rockets. Maybe they'll blow up. Maybe we'll all die, or maybe we'll invent the rocket. Let's see what happens. And we're kind of still in that mentality. And I think we've got to be careful. But to answer your question, yeah, all of this, I think, is the result of that cargo cult idea that I talked about initially. We're part of that cargo cult. We're trying to duplicate technology that we saw thousands and thousands of years ago. And we're desperately all trying to do that. And it's built around space travel, and it's built around immortality. These two major things that we associate with the divine, living in the heavens and being immortal. And our medicine, our science is developed towards trying to defeat all illnesses and human longevity, cryogenics, whatever it happens to be, to make us live forever, and also to reach the stars. So that was our initial impetus as social beings, and I think it's still with us. And it was prompted by events like that Berosus wrote about.
It's almost like God creation, like we're creating our own God from what we remember of our initial encounter with the other, and but maybe we're not taking enough care. We're almost at an hour. I have one more question, if you don't mind, and I think this is an important one. In your book, you at one point talk about the closest that we've come in terms of conceptualizing what the other is that you think has real use was the jinn. And you mentioned Amira El-Zain's book, and I've ordered it, and I can't wait to read it because I think it's going to be fascinating. But the quote that you have in the book is, the closest we come to this idea in pre-scientific literature is in the Arab idea of the jinn, beings like us who inhabit the earth the way that we do, but which live invisibly to us in what might be called somewhat erroneously a different dimension. Oddly, we are not the first to suggest a connection between the idea of the jinn and the nature of the phenomenon. Ufology is not a science, but a process of initiation. One starts with field investigations and ends up studying Arab mystics, which I love, and that's almost the exact process that I went through. But how should we consider that? I mean, what can we learn from the history of, the Islamic tradition of jinn? And is that, do you think it's a one-to-one connection? I mean, is that accurately describing the nature of the other, and that there are different tribes of others, and that they are not necessarily all good or all bad? They're kind of all over the map. And maybe that makes war planning like kind of self-defeating, because we're not actually fighting a unified foe, but rather it's a sort of a wilderness of all kinds of creatures out there.
Yeah. That quotation by Aimé Michel was quoted by Jacques Vallée, right? That's where I got that quotation from. I think it's fascinating stuff. And it's it's true. You start by studying one thing, you wind up studying mysticism. And that happened to me. It's happened to a lot of people. The jinn are an excellent way of looking at this. And it's really pre-Islamic as well. I mean, it became incorporated into Islam later, and Islam is given a canonical status as well. If you're a Muslim, you believe in the jinn. They're real, right?
Yeah.
So this is something that is maybe hard to wrap your heads around if you're not a Muslim, but this is a reality. It's in the Quran, and it's in the Hadith and everything else. So the jinn are real. And the fascinating thing about them is that they look like us, pretty much. And at times they cohabit with humans. That's the other thing, right? So you have all of the elements necessary, for describing the UFO phenomenon, the contactee phenomenon on the one hand, but also, the jinn on the other. They really do get very close together. It's like they're talking about the same thing. But what your point that you just brought up, though, is fascinating. You put your finger on something. What if our wars are not what we think they are, right? What if we're fighting two countries are fighting with each other in warfare, but there's an entire jinn element to it that we don't see, we're not aware of. And the jinn are kind of connected to us because they're aware of us. According to Islam, some jinn have actually converted to Islam, right? So that means that automatically there's an interpenetration of their world and ours.
Yeah.
So if we're blowing shit up, as in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right, we get their attention. And that's been part of the UFO sort of mythology for a long time, is that this all started because we started dropping atomic bombs. And then everybody became, nervous on the other side, the jinn side. They became aware of us and they started visiting and trying to see what the hell it is that we're up to, So that's a very good, angle of looking at this, that the war is not the war that we think it is, that our struggle is not, between countries alone, but between principalities, and as it says in the Bible. So there's a different war that's taking place. There's a war here, but there's a war there, and they're mirror images of each other. And if we can construct a peace here, doesn't that automatically imply that we're constructing a peace there as well? And that's like an interesting place to end the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it puts it all back in our hands.
Yeah, back in our hands again. Yeah.